Are you a writer whose mind is a whirlwind of creativity and distraction? Hello and welcome to Writing While Distracted, the writing podcast that helps you transform your scattered thoughts into literary brilliance. I'm your host, Brenda Murphy, and your NeuroSpicy writing coach. For writers of all kinds, but particularly those dealing with distraction and mental health issues, on this podcast, you'll hear positive advice for staying focused amidst the chaos of your mind, along with writing tips to help you find your story's beginning and use your strengths to get to the end of your novel. Here, creativity thrives in the midst of chaos. Stay tuned as we discuss pre-writing, or as I like to call it, outlining for the outline impaired. I had a struggling writer ask me, "How do you get all those words? I start writing and then I just fade out. The story stops. How do I expand my story?" The short answer to this is to pre-write and to outline. And I can hear the pantsers out there screaming, and I get that. I am not an outliner by nature. But in the last 10 years, and after 20 full-length books, I know the value of at least a bare bones set of notes of where the story is going before I start. I am not talking about a full-on, bullet-pointed outline so detailed you only have to add conjunctions to make it a book. There are people that make those, and I applaud them. That is not something that is within my capabilities. And if you're listening to this podcast, it may not be within your capabilities either, but I'm here to tell you that is only one way to write a book. And no matter what your 9th grade English teacher told you, or anybody else has told you, you do not have to have a detailed outline to write a book. But you do need some sort of guidelines so that you can get where you want to go with the story without wandering around too much in the weeds. I'm talking about making a scene list. I'm talking about a few pages of notes so that when you get to the swampy middle of the book, you'll have somewhere to look to see what you need to do to finish the book. And if you're wondering what I mean by the swampy middle, that's the 25 to 40,000 word mark, depending on how long of a book you're writing. And you need to find a way to wade through that part of your book to get to the end. So a lot of people start out, they really know how their story starts and beginning, and they know how their story ends. A lot of people do when they start writing, or they have a vague idea. Or if you're writing genre fiction, you know, in a romance, they're happy ever after. In a murder mystery, they solve the murder. In a thriller, you stop the big bad from doing the big bad thing. So if you know the answer to the end of your story, how you get there is what's important. And I've spoken about that before in some of the other podcasts. But that really is what's important, is how you get to the end. If you're one of those folks who can just whip out 80,000 words with no outline, then look away, shut your ears. This podcast is not for you. There have been some very famous and successful writers who've never outlined and could simply sit down and write their books without an outline in sight, and that is fantastic for them. This post is for us mere mortals who need at least some direction to keep going forward in our work. But wait, you say, "I've already started my book. How is this going to help me?" Or, "Hey, stop, I'm 20,000 words in and stuck. What do I do?" I got you, my friend. You can go back and do this work no matter where you are in the process. If you are stuck, blocked, frustrated with your manuscript, and ready to set it on fire, the techniques below are a great way to get unstuck. And even though I label them pre-writing, you can go back and do any of this writing at any time that you need. There have been times where I've had to go back and rework my character sheets because the original set of wants and needs and desires and goals for my characters are just not working in the story that I want to tell. Or I might need to add a new character because things are just gone off the rails and I'm lost, and so I need some help. So even though it's labeled pre-writing, you can do any of these techniques at any time to get back on track. I also have a podcast that's specifically about what to do if you are restarting a manuscript after a long layoff. So say you started a book, life happened, and it's now 6 weeks, 6 months, 6 years later, and you want to pick it up and start your manuscript again. There are techniques in that podcast, and I'll leave a link in the show notes for that for you so you can listen to that if you're in that situation. So what are the steps? The first step is pre-writing. And what do I mean by pre-writing? This is what I consider a basic list of things that you need to think about before you start writing your novel. Or if you're stuck, this is how to get unstuck. You have to think about, what kind of novel am I writing? What's my story about? Is it genre fiction? Is it literary fiction? Is it creative nonfiction? Is it nonfiction or memoir? Knowing very securely what you're writing will help a lot in helping you organize your thoughts about what your book is and what criteria it should meet. Because if you're writing genre, there are specific criteria that you want to meet and specific beats that you want to hit in your work, because readers read those books obsessively and they want the story to hit certain marks. It's okay to be unique, but there are certain plot points that you're going to need to hit, particularly if you're writing something that has a complicated plot, like a mystery or a thriller, a police procedural, detective story, or if you're writing creative nonfiction. If you're retelling a story that actually has a real ending, you need to be careful how you think about that and how you plan that. So that's the first step. What the heck are you writing? Step 2, how long is it? And we've talked before about sticking to genre lengths, because if you're trying to get published by one of the big 3, or to get an agent, or to submit to an acquiring editor, or to enter a contest, if there's a specific word count, you have to stick to it. You need to look what their requirements are, and you need to stick to those word counts. Having a word count will also help you figure out how to reverse engineer what your deadline should be, when you should be finished your first draft, when you should start your revisions, when you should be through your revisions so you can send it to your beta readers, when you can do your editing, when you can do all of the things. You're going to need to have a rough sort of a timeline, because there are a lot of steps to finishing a book. I'll link to that list of story lengths again in the show notes so that you'll have those. Step 3, who are my characters? What do they want? And how many characters do I need to tell this story? And this is important because even though your book may just be about a couple, say if you're writing a romance, or one person if you're writing a detective story, there are going to be a lot of other characters that they interact with. And some of those characters need to be full-fleshed characters in that you know them inside out and they're like real people to you. And some of those characters are what I tend to call one-offs or throwaway characters. They're that person that might drop a bit of dialogue that has important information. It doesn't mean that you should rely on stereotypes or in any way blow off these little characters, as I like to call them. They're the side people. Don't blow them off. They can play important roles, so you need to take time to build them too. If you're working on a series, if you're planning out a series, if you're writing about a family, you're going to write about the family members. You need to know your people. You are creating a little imaginary town or setting or village, or if you're writing a huge space opera, think about all the people that come into those novels. This is not to put you off. You don't have to know every single character you're going to need before you start. I often start with just my 2 main characters and a very loose list of other people that I'm going to need, and I create those characters as I come to them in the story, because again, I am somewhere between a pantser and an outliner. I don't work from a hard and fast outline. I work from a scene list, and if I get to a scene and I need to add some people in, I add some people in on the fly. I have a character workbook that I'm going to link in the show notes. Again, you can get that for free. It will get you started on just some basic things that you should think about when developing a character. I'll have another podcast that goes more specifically into all of the work that should go into your main characters to make them full-rounded people and not cardboard cutouts that are just going through the motions. Step 4, what point of view am I writing this book from? And point of view can be a very complicated discussion. Point of view can be very complicated when you're first starting out writing and you're not exactly sure what the heck anybody's talking about. My advice is that you check out Sandra Gerth's book, Point of View, How to Use the Different Point of View Types and Avoid Head Hopping and Choose the Best Point of View for Your book. She's also known as Jay, an amazing sapphic fiction author and a wonderful wonderful person, get the book, read it. You can get it on Amazon. I'm going to leave the link below. You might be able to find it in your library. It is not a very long book, but it is totally worth your time. There are exercises in there, and it really explains characters and why you should choose the character that you're going to choose to tell your story. It's very, very good for anybody really in their writing career, but if you're just starting out, it's the one I recommend to everybody. Step 5, what do your characters want? And again, you can download my free character workbook. You need to know that before you start your stories, even as Kurt Vonnegut said, even if they just want a glass of water. Why are they doing the things that they're doing? Do they want love? Do they want revenge? Do they want success? Do they want fame? Do they want fortune? It doesn't matter what they want, but you need to know for sure why they're behaving the way that they are. That way, you won't get as stuck. I mean, there'll be times where you can't figure out exactly how to show why they're doing what they're doing. But if you know what it is they're supposed to be doing or why they're motivated to do those things, you will be a long way ahead of anybody else who's just trying to fly along and make it up as they go along. Stories are about people. And the more you know about the people in your book, the better your book is going to be. Now, this is where you start thinking for step 6 about your character arc. How are your characters going to change? And again, you don't have to know every single thing. But if you have someone who is an outright loner at the beginning of the book, and by the end of the book, they're ready to move in with a found family, something big has changed. And you don't have to say how it changed. You can just say loner becomes family member. I've written that as a note to myself. Loner becomes family member. Hardcore, I'm going to be single for the rest of my life, falls madly in love. I don't have to write down every single step of how they get from point A to point B, but you have to know where they're going. And again, that will help you in moving forward in your book. Step 7, where does my story take place? What time of year is it? What's my setting? This is going to inform your research. Now, the kinds of things you're going to research are going to be pop culture, current events, news events, things that your characters would experience together or maybe within their timeline are going to influence your story. And those are the things that you need to know. If you're going to set it in 18th century London or 15th century Spain or 12th century Norway, you need to know those things. You need to do the research. Again, you don't have to know all the research, but making a note to yourself of what kind of research you need to do to get started, again, will keep you from getting bogged down in the middle. I make a list of research topics that I need to explore. For example, my recent book was about a fire investigator, and I had to do a lot of research into what does that person do? How do they fit into the fire department? What are their job skills? What do they need to know? I didn't have to know enough to become a fire investigator, but I had to know enough to be able to put those little details into your book that let people know that this person really is and doing the things a fire investigator would do. It also influenced her behavior in the book. So those are the kinds of things I'm talking about with figuring out your setting, figuring out things about your character. That's going to inform your research and keep your book moving along. Step 9, and this is probably the hardest step. You want to figure out what your deadline is. Now, if you are writing a short story or a short piece of fiction, or you have a book contracted, you've got a hard and fast deadline. If you're writing something for a contest, you've got a deadline. And what I suggest people do is take that deadline date, the drop dead date, the last date that you can possibly submit that book, and then work backwards to where you think you could have it written, finished, and edited. And from there, work back to when you could have your first draft done. Always give yourself twice as long as you think you're going to need. Even if you can knock out a 2,000-word short story in an afternoon, it's not finished. You're going to need to edit it. You might want to send it to beta readers. You might want to just sit on it for a little bit and see if it's as good as you think it is. Go back, read what they're asking for the short story collection, those kinds of things, or magazines you're submitting to, or wherever you're sending it. Don't rush your work is what I'm trying to say here. Give yourself enough of a deadline so that you can do the best you can to have the best written piece of work you can produce, to have the best edited piece of work you can produce, to really increase your chances of being accepted. Hustle culture and the myth that you need to release a book, 4 books a year to be successful, has made more than one person who wants to be an author believe that they just can't because they couldn't possibly produce that much in a year. And I've written 3 books in a year, and that was a lot. And I didn't have time for a lot of other things. And I have a family and I want to spend time with them. So I've cut back and now I only write 1 or 2 books a year. And that's okay. And that's something that you need to consider. But if this is your very first book that you're writing, the thing that's most important is to just write the book. Give yourself enough time that you can produce a quality product. Take your time to create the best book you can. You owe it to yourself to do that. Don't be discouraged by people who write faster than you. There's always going to be somebody who's going to write faster. There's always going to be somebody who's going to write slower. Writing a book is very individual. Write how you want to write. Don't pay attention to what anybody tells you you have to do. You have to do this, you have to do that. You have to write so many words a day. Write what you can, because consistency is way more important than number of words. Because a lot of people who write a lot of words every day eventually end up burning themselves out and they quit writing altogether. And I don't want that to be you. Writing is something you can do for your entire life. So hold on to it and don't burn yourself out by trying to copy someone else's work schedule. So we've talked about all the things you need to answer before you start writing a book. And I say answer these in as much detail as you can and do what works for you. It might take 2 or 3 days for some questions, like the ones about your characters and their wants. After that, take your time and write out your story broadly, not in detail, but in the big scenes. You can tell it to yourself like you would explain it to a writer friend over beverages. You wouldn't put it all in detail, but you would highlight the most important points of your story. And that's what needs to be in place for the next step. I use pen and paper for this. Usually a dollar store composition notebook or cheap notebook makes it feel less fraught, less precious, and lets me scribble without the pressure that comes with staring at a blank document on my computer or writing in a fancy journal, stressing about the fact that I'm about to write a whole ass book. And feel free to insert your own freak out here. So after you've written your scenes in broad strokes, and you've finished your scene list and your pre-writing, set it aside for a few days and then come back to it. Now, some people would start writing at this point, but the one extra step that I like to take before I start writing is to transfer my list of scenes to 3x5 cards. And yes, I use 3x5 cards because if I use 4x6 cards, I will want to write too much information on them. I want only enough to write maybe a sentence or two about what goes on in the scene. And when I say bare bones, I write things like, they fight here, big breakup, busted. Sometimes it's just a single word, but it'll remind me of what's going on. I also put down what characters are in the scene. I'll write their names on it, whose point of view it's from, and where it takes place. So like, Sophia's point of view in the car, busted. So that's just what I do. That's what works for me. And you can try this to see if it'll work for you too. But by distilling a scene down to what it's supposed to be about, it doesn't feel overwhelming. I don't feel so locked in. So if I sit down and I want the scene to be outrageous, or if I decide to disregard that scene completely, I can. I don't feel locked into a hard and fast outline. It's more like a trellis that my story can grow on. So once I've transferred them to those 3x5 cards, so all the little scenes to the 3x5 cards, I take a highlighter and run a color line across the top of the card for whoever's point of view it is. Now, sometimes my books are from one person's point of view, so that's really easy. And putting that color line across the top of the cards really enabled me to visualize if I had the scenes equally distributed in the novel. So once I've got all the cards written, I lay them out on a big flat surface. Usually I work on the floor because I don't have a big enough table in my house to lay out between 60 and 75 scene cards, because that's about the average length novel that I write. I go with the idea that each scene is about 1,000 words. That can vary. Obviously, some of my scenes are much longer than that. Some of my scenes are shorter, but 1,000 seems to get me where I want to go. Feel free to copy that number. Once you've been writing for a while, you'll know what your average scene length is. You'll know about how long they are. And then you can plug your own numbers in about how many scenes you need to tell a story. Sorting and viewing the cards this way also helps me with structure and pacing. And I have another podcast that I'll talk specifically about structure and pacing in your novel. It'll help demonstrate if there's gaps or plot holes in my storyline. If I don't have a scene that's supposed to be there to tell a very significant part of the story. So then I can scribble down a couple of lines like, fall in love scene here, or they find the killer, or she discovers the secret passage. Whatever it is that I need to fix the plot, I can stick those in at that point in time versus getting to the middle of my manuscript and going, oh man, this isn't working. It's broken. What scenes do I need to fix it? I've already done that in the pre-writing stage and in the pre-card sorting stage. Now, there are ways to do this electronically. If you use Scrivener, you can do that directly in the application. I don't, because I'm very tactile, and I also, again, tend to write too much on the cards versus if I'm just working on 3x5 cards that I can sort by hand. You can use Milanote. That's another app that people can use to outline and organize their thoughts with cards versus hard copy cards. I will link to Scrivener and Milanote in the show notes so you guys can check those out. Having your story sorted into tangible bits, if you are a visual person, and I am, that is basically how my mind works in pictures, it's very helpful for me. Now, if you're not someone that works in pictures, if you're someone who needs to dictate or relies on voice to text because of visual impairment, you can still do this with the apps. You can totally dictate in Scrivener. You can totally use your microphone with Milanote. Most things these days, most apps these days, at least with the Mac system, and that's the one I operate on, will work with the speech to text feature in Mac. So that's a really helpful thing. So you can still work with this method if you need to dictate for whatever reason. I didn't come up with this method. I learned it from watching Dustin Lance Black talk about his building and creative method for when he writes screenplays. And I'll link to that video in the show notes too, because it is totally worth the time watching it. Again, write consistently, do your pre-writing. Remember that genre fiction has beats that you need to hit if you want to write in that genre. Now, if you're blending genres, you can have a lot of fun because you don't have to necessarily hit all the ones for each genre. So enjoy and experiment and play with genre fiction in ways that you can blend it together and make it be what you want. Will this method work for you? Will pre-writing work for you? I don't know, but I'm going to submit if you haven't been able to finish a book, or you haven't been able to get a book published, or you're just unhappy with the way your writing's going, give it a shot. You have nothing to lose by trying a different method of work. And you might find something, or you might find parts of it work for you. Take the parts that work for you and keep them and let go of the rest. Books are constructed of scenes, and one of the best books I've ever read about how scenes mesh together to make a book is called Make a Scene by Jordan Rosenfeld, and I will link to that in the show notes too. Totally worth your time. You can probably find it at the library. I think that's where I got my first copy. I then went and bought a copy because I had a lot of underlining I wanted to do in that. Really a great way to think about your novel in bite-sized chunks, because it's overwhelming to think, I need to write 80,000 words. How can I write 80,000 words? It's not as overwhelming to think, I only have to write this scene today. I only have to write this 1,000 words today, or I only have to write this 500 words or 250, or whatever your magic number is that you can keep track of your writing, whether it's time. I only need to write for 15 minutes today, or half an hour, or 30 minutes, or an hour, whatever. You can track your writing any way that you want, but I am going to strongly encourage you to set up some system for tracking your writing and tracking your progress, because that's how you know you're moving ahead. And it is too easy, especially for neurodivergent people, to become overwhelmed, to become convinced that we're never going to finish, to get bored with our work sometimes if we don't have an end goal that we can see. If we can see the end, if we can know that there is an end point to our struggle of writing this book, there can be a lot of motivation in working towards that. So, try this method. Give yourself a deadline. Work your magic with your pre-writing. And remember, just don't quit. Take what you need and leave the rest. So I hope this podcast has helped you understand what pre-writing is and how it can help you get your book to the finish line. If you have questions or comments, please email me. My email's in the show notes. You can contact me through that. Thanks for tuning in to Writing While Distracted, where we navigate the winding roads of creativity amidst the chaos of distraction. If you've enjoyed this podcast and found it useful, please share it and tag me. DM me and let me know what you found useful. Please leave a review. It really helps get the podcast in front of more folks. Remember, in the dance between focus and diversion, every stumble is a step closer to mastering the art of writing. Join us next time as we continue to unravel the mysteries of the writer's mind. Until then, keep writing, keep wandering, and embrace the distractions that fuel your creativity. Stay tuned, stay inspired.